granted by millions of people, and not just in America, that the US is the dominant global power, for better or worse, or for both. But is that still true? That's the question Newsweek international editor Fareed Zakaria examines extensively in his new book, The Post-American World. The title offers a hint of his answer. He sat down this week with Matt Fry.
So, Fareed, looking at America today, the subprime crisis, you've got two wars that are arguably difficult in Iraq and Afghanistan. You've got the war on terror. You've got a crisis of confidence here in the United States, where 82% of Americans, according to the latest poll, believe that this country is heading in the wrong direction. Does all that, though, add up to the decline of this nation, or is that being too alarmist?
I think it points to something very important, which is all this is happening exactly as you described, but the rest of the world is buoyant, is robust, is growing. You could not have predicted this, and it wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that America would be in a financial, economic, political crisis, and China would be growing at 9%, and India would be growing at 9%, and really the rest of the world is thriving. That's the shift, and that's producing in some ways a more stable world, I would argue, but it is producing what I call in the book a post-American world, a world in which the United States is not the director of all that happens.
But it's neither a zero-sum game as well, is it? I mean, it's not as if America has lost some of its influence, and as a result of that, other people are getting more influence. It's just that the world, or rather the penthouse of power, is becoming a more crowded place.
A very good point. Economically, you're absolutely right. It's a win-win. The pie expands, the global economy keeps expanding, and as a result, everyone, on average, gets richer, and standards of living rise. But politically, the struggle for influence is something of a zero-sum game. You know, as Brazil becomes a more important player in Latin America, and as China becomes more important in Asia, and as India becomes more important in South Asia, whose power is being constrained? What was the country that had untrammeled ability to act in all these areas? The United States. So at the level of politics and diplomacy, I do think the rise of the rest places certain constraints on American power and American influence.
But the real secret of America's influence wasn't just the hard power of military might, it was also the soft power of its idea, of American culture. Has that gone into decline as well?
I think there are two things. First of all, we Americans like to flatter ourselves into thinking that all our power in some ways derived from our ideas. I think it probably also derived from the fact that we were the wealthiest nation in the world, the strongest military in the world, that in many ways people looked at America and said, the future is being invented here. And if the future is now being invented in many other places, that does dull the allure. But I think that there's no question the United States, when it acts and lives up to its ideals, is a source of enormous inspiration. I think it's very important, therefore, that we start living up to our ideals and not just proclaiming.
So you're saying that America in 2008 needs to be rebooted, as it were?
It does need to be rebooted. It needs to rediscover its real sources of strength. I mean, what does the United States do so well? Why am I, at the end of the day, confident that even in a post-American world, America will thrive? It's the most open society in the world. It takes in ideas, people, goods, services, mixes them all up, and it is enriched and ennobled by that prospect. But just as the world is opening up, what I worry is that America is closing down, is becoming suspicious of the very things that made it strong.
And are we also seeing countries like China, which aren't exactly identified with openness, espousing some of those American ideas? I mean, just look at the events this week. The response to the earthquake sees a Chinese government behaving like a great power behaves towards its own people. In other words, accountable and responsible. Is there a danger then for America in this game that some of America's ideas are being espoused by the very countries that threaten it economically?
I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the way that the Chinese are acting compared to, say, 30 years ago, you know, the madness of Mao and things like that, it's enormous progress. I don't worry about it, though, because it does mean a more stable world, a more peaceful world. Look, if China feels that it has a stake in this international system, then its rise can be accommodated within it. If Russia can feel the same way, its rise can be accommodated. But it does mean that we will have to get used to a world in which these countries are not, rogue demons, but actually equals. And
Do you think America is ready for that?
I don't know. America it knows how to fight rogue demons. You know, we understand how to fight the battle of good versus evil. How do you fight the battle of equals? A competition in which, you know, everyone is playing the same game. They are, as you point out, all copying the United States. This is the irony. We've been telling the world to open up their markets, open themselves up to trade for the last 50 years. Finally, they've said, okay, and we're thunderstruck.
So if the United States stops being exceptional, unique, different to everyone else, does it stop being the United States? Is that what you need in order to thrive here?
A wonderful question. I think that the United States remains exceptional in some very core ways still. The United States is still creating the only universal nation in the world. And we take in more people every year as legal immigrants than the rest of the world put together. We take them from all over the world and we assimilate them in ways that no one else can. We are still more open to outside influences, goods, services. But what I worry about is that we're losing it not because the rest of the world is catching up. That's fine. And that's a win-win. But because we're getting scared. And we're getting scared by this prospect and we're cowardly.
You said that earlier, that the real danger for America here is not the rise of other nations, but the shrinking, if you like, of America's horizons. Is that really what's going on here? And is it as a result of 9/11? Is it as a result of economic weakness at the moment, the declining dollar? How would you pinpoint that?
I think it's happening because of a combination of things. Certainly 9/11 has had something to do with it. Politicians have found that it is very useful politically to scare Americans. The economy is part of it. But I think the broadest force here is the power of globalization, churning this whole economy. The American economy loses 4 million jobs every month. And it produces 4.2 million jobs every month. But that churn produces an enormous amount of anxiety. So people look around and they sense that the world is changing and they worry that for the first time in living memory, the United States is not leading that change, but is subject to it, just like any other country. And then you have the demagogues who take advantage of it. So it's all